Hello, book people. PT Hylton here. I am recording this live, so if you're watching it later, um, this was a live thing. That's why I feel like the stream is sometimes a little more choppy when you do these lives rather than a nice recorded, edited video. So just wanted to give you that thought to start off. Anyway, today is the beginning of NaNoWriMo, and I'm excited. I decided just like late last night that I would participate. The reason I was not sure if I was going to was I've been working on these Zane Halloway novellas. I've been doing one a month for the last 5 months, and yeah, it turns out that that was pretty that was pretty hard. It burned me out a little bit, and I was going to take a month off of any like real high pressure kind of writing. Not that this is like really high pressure, but you know what I mean, any like specific deadlines for myself. But I saw a bunch of other people were getting in on the fun, and I couldn't help it. So I'm joining in. So what I want to talk about today is 3 of my tips for NaNoWriMo. I feel a little strange sometimes giving you like advice, like what do I know? But whether you think my writing is good or not is basically beside the point, because I do feel like one thing I do know is I do know how to write a fair amount and write fairly consistently. So I'm going to give you a few tips towards that. I've written somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 words this year, which, you know, there's plenty of people who do a lot more than that. But for me, it's the first year that I've been pretty like consistently putting out a pretty good word count. Although I have had some dry spells in there, but you know, for the most part, I've been writing most days. So I'm going to give 3 kind of tips for people who are kind of taking on this NaNoWriMo thing and want to consistently write. The first one, and this is going to be weird because this is a writing advice video basically, but the first piece of advice is that most writing advice is crap, but you should probably try it anyway. And here's what I mean by that. Maybe it's a little harsh to say most writing advice is crap but here's what I think happens. I think people stumble around, try to figure out what they're doing, and once they finally feel like they're comfortable writing and feel like they're writing consistently, they feel like they've unlocked the secret, and they sometimes put it out there like, oh my God, I've unlocked the secret, here it is. You can use this secret too to help you succeed in writing. Where I'm always very skeptical of people who say those kind of things or think that their path is the path, their way is the way, because I think writing is one of those things where it's so different for everyone that something that works very well for you might not work very well at all for me. And a lot of writing advice, I used to really think that it was like a equation, like if I just followed this certain formula, I'd be able to write every day. And a lot of the advice out there has taken me off that path and really frustrated me at times. One example of that is, you know, I remember reading like in high school this book about how important it was to build your characters beforehand, and it had like all these worksheets with like, you know, things you should know about your characters. And I know plenty of writers who do this kind of stuff today. I know writers who do like 100 questionnaires about their character, and that really helps them, and great. You know, I'm not saying that's bad at all. If it works for them, that's awesome. For me, the writing process, part of the fun of the writing process is knowing learning about the characters as I go. I feel like, you know, filling out a list of questions about what does your character eat for breakfast, and, you know, what's the most traumatic experience in your character's life, things like that. For me personally, I feel like if I know all those facts about you, I still don't know you as a person. I don't know you as a person until I see you in action. And when I start writing and start kind of discovering what the character is like, that's the first time I can get to know them. I've done the thing of trying to fill out questionnaires and figure out everything possible about the characters before I start. For me personally, that doesn't work. And so that's what I mean by the most writing advice is crap. Again, that's kind of harsh, I guess. Let me rephrase it. Most writing advice won't work for you, but you should try to follow it. There is writing advice that has worked for me a lot. For instance, one piece that's really worked for me is, I think it's a Hemingway piece of advice. I'm not positive, but I think he's the one who said something along the lines of, you should stop writing every day when you still know what happens next, so that the next day when you sit down at the keyboard, you know exactly what's going to happen next. You can get going, get rolling on that without any trouble. So that's a piece of writing advice that works for me. But the thing is, it's a process, and I guess the whole point of this first piece of writing of this number one thing is don't feel like you're doing it wrong. If a piece of writing advice that works for one of your favorite writers and you try to follow their process and it doesn't work for you, don't feel like a failure. Don't feel bad about that. Everyone is different in their process, and there is no one way. And take people who say there is a one way with a very big grain of salt, because I don't think that's true at all. You'll often hear the terms kind of panters and plotters versus like people who plot out their book and outline it first versus people who just kind of go in not knowing too much about it. I don't really like those terms just because, plotting sounds kind of like a slow train going along, maybe chugga, 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 and panting seems like, I don't care what happens. I'm just going to run in there. And I don't think those are very good descriptions of either way. I think they're both super valid ways. Personally, I'm more of a pantser as far as I go in, like part of the process of writing for me is discovering what the story is, and that's what makes it exciting. And when I try to outline it too much beforehand, I feel like I'm just doing like a weird connect the dots thing when I'm writing, and it doesn't feel as lively or as organic. And again, that's not a judgment call. Plenty of people do awesome work with outlining. It's just what works for me. So instead of pantsing and plotting, maybe we can call it like map makers and explorers or something. I don't know, because I feel like pantsing and plotting are both kind of like weird, like negative connotations to them in my mind. So anyway, that was long, but that was my first piece of advice, which is most writing advice won't work for you, but you should try it to see what does work for you. And don't feel bad when some writing advice doesn't work for you. Okay, that was number one. Number two is, and this is kind of like more geared towards people who maybe haven't done a ton of writing in the past or haven't written something this long maybe, and that is kind of keep your eyes forward on the story. I think you'll find that if you haven't done a lot of this before, especially if you read a lot, which I know a lot of us do who are trying to write, when you go back and read your work, it's not going to seem very good for the most part. Sometimes you'll see little sections that'll really get you excited, but for the most part, when you go back and look at it, it may not be good. And for me personally, when I was first starting out writing novel length stuff, that was very frustrating for me because you're putting in weeks and weeks on end on this thing, sometimes months. And you look back and you're like, oh, this isn't good. Am I just completely wasting my time? But I think there's a couple of very valid reasons why it doesn't look good. For one thing, if you read a lot of very polished, very edited, very final draft stuff. You're probably not used to reading first drafts. And what you're reading from yourself is a first draft. So of course it's not going to match up to those polished things. Now, I'm not saying that of course your novel is for sure guaranteed to be awesome once it gets polished up, but I am saying that it's pretty guaranteed not to be awesome when it's your first draft. That's just the way it works for most people. There are the super rare people who can totally go in there and write a very clean first draft and have it be readable. But those people are pretty few and far between. For most people, it takes a lot of revision to get to the point of where anyone else would want to read it. So personally, and I'm not going to give this as advice because I think this is definitely one of those things that works for some people and not others. But for me personally, I try not to even look back at my stuff until I've completed my first draft. Now, I know that's not for everyone. Some people do like to really polish as they go. They'll work on a chapter and then go back and polish that chapter before they keep going, which is, again, it's no judgment call. It's whatever your way is your way, whatever works for you. For me personally, I feel like it's kind of like if you're building a jigsaw puzzle and you can't find this one piece in the corner and you're just focusing on that one little corner and you can't find the piece. You're looking through the thousands of pieces to find that piece. It's a lot easier to find that one piece if you just forget about that one piece for now and keep going, build the frame, start filling stuff in. And then when there's only a few pieces left, a few holes left, it's going to be a lot easier to find what goes there. So keep your eyes forward, keep moving forward, whatever you do. That's kind of my second piece of advice for that. Yeah, is there something else I was going to say about that as far as the keep moving forward? Yeah, I guess that's it. All right, my third piece of writing advice is, and this is like, I haven't heard this anywhere else, which I'm not going to be like so bold to say I'm the one who came up with this first or anything like that. But it is something that I use a lot that I haven't seen written down anywhere else. And so I'm going to lay it out for you here. And it's basically give yourself lots of dangling plot threads. And here's what I mean by that. So for instance, put in like puzzles that you don't know the answer to as you're writing. In that way, later when you get stuck and you don't know what to write next, you can come back to that. I'm going to give you a more concrete example because that's kind of vague. In my book, Regulation 19, there's a woman in it named Christine who's a doctor, and I really didn't know what her role in the story was going to be. I knew what her relationship to the main character was and that was important, but I didn't know like what her role was going to be. So in this one scene, I had her go to her freezer, and look inside of it and see that there was a severed head in there. And I had no idea what that meant, where that came from, why this woman would have a severed head in her freezer. But I knew that was just something interesting about her and something crazy that I could come back to later and use later when I was stuck and I didn't know what to do. I could be like, all right, well, what was the deal with that severed head? If it turned out that I wasn't going to use the severed head, I could always go back and take that little section out. But it really helps me personally to leave a lot of those things that I don't know the answer to earlier in the story so that later I can, when I don't know what to do, I can answer those unanswered questions from earlier. Another good example is I wrote a series of fantasy novellas, and the main character is this guy Zane. In the first book, he hears his door open, and I just put in there, had him wonder who was going to be coming through the door and be nervous if it was going to be one of his enemies. And then I said, maybe it's the Longstrain pirates, maybe it's maybe it's Jacob von Ridden, maybe it's and I listed like all these different enemies that he had. I didn't know who any of those people were or what their role was in his life. I just wanted to have him kind of like be worried about who could be coming through that door. And I wanted to give the reader the feeling that this is a person with a lot of enemies. But it was very helpful to me later because in the second, third, and fourth novellas, I was able to, those characters that I just kind of mentioned, throwaway in there, turned out to be the main story in future novellas. So there you go. That's my third piece of advice. Give yourself stuff that you don't know the answer to. I'd say even if you're the kind of person who likes to outline and know everything, maybe just try throwing in a couple things in there that you don't know the answer to, and maybe later it pays off, maybe not. You can always take it out. It's always easier to fix things for me when the book is over. One example of that, again, in Regulation 19, was that there's two characters who had two kids, and like halfway through the book, I realized one of the kids was basically unnecessary and I wasn't doing anything with them. So I just changed it to them having one kid, and I just kept writing the second half of the book as if they had one child. And I kept thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to be so hard to go back to that first half of the book and get rid of that second child. I'm gonna have to rewrite so much stuff. It wasn't hard at all. It took me like a half hour to exercise that child from the book, which probably says I wasn't using them very much, and I was right to get rid of them. But there you go. Related to that third piece of advice, I heard a really good piece of writing advice from Christina Farley, who wrote the Gilded books. The other day, she wrote a blog post about NaNoWriMo, and she said if you get stuck, have your character do something crazy, like just have them run up and kiss a stranger on the street or just punch someone or whatever to get yourself unstuck. And most of the time you'll delete those things, but sometimes you might not. Sometimes those things might turn out to be gold. So that's kind of, I guess, related to my third point. So those are my three kind of tips, and they were most writing advice probably won't work for you, but you should try it anyway. Keep moving forward, and throw some dangling threads in there for yourself that you can use as a lifeline later. And final tip, free tip number 4 that I meant to work in somewhere else, but I'll just say it now, which is there's going to be a point when you're moving on with the book and you're going to come up with a different idea, and you're going to be like, this other idea is so much better than what I'm working on. Don't answer that siren song. Don't dive into those waters. Keep going with what you're working on. For me personally, this is another bad piece of writing advice I heard, which was that if you're stuck or if you're wake up in the morning and you're not excited about the project you're working on, that means you're working on the wrong project and you should put it aside and work on something else, which I wanted to choke that advice. I wanted to grab it by the throat because, again, maybe for some people that's great advice. For me personally, I would never finish anything if I followed that advice. The thing that I'm not working on is always more attractive to me than the thing that I'm working on. That's just the way my brain works, is I'm easily distracted, and the idea of a story that's still like perfect and unwritten is way more appealing than the messy story I'm actually in. So I have to take those siren songs of different ideas and push them aside while I'm working on my thing. So stick to what you're working on. All right, that is my 3.5 pieces of writing advice, and see my number one again. Maybe none of this will work for you or be helpful to you, but I hope it is. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear what's the best writing advice you have or you've ever gotten. Feel free to leave it in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.